First, in order to explain and determine whether or not humans are evolving, we need to know what it means to be evolving. Today, evolution means change. Biological evolution is the change in the properties of groups of organisms over the course of generations. We have to remember that evolution operates at the level of a population and natural selection operates at the level of species. It's very important to understand the difference here. The key idea here is that individual organisms do not evolve. Populations undergo what we call descent with modification. Now that we know the scientific definition of evolution, let's look at some of the terms we have gone over in class and how, in my opinion, prove that species are changing not only at the micro level but the macro as well, because we have evidence for both. Starting with the concept of genetic drift, we have to remember that the key to this is population size. We see in many species that under genetic drift, alleles are selectively neutral and selection and fitness is removed, which I thought was very interesting because before I had this idea that evolution had to do with selection and adaptation, but this isn't always necessarily the case, and I think a lot of people will find this to be a shock because if you were to ask a random person in the street what evolution meant to them, some of the first things anyone would say would be survival of the fittest and natural selection. So a lot of people have this misconception on what evolution really is, which chapters 8 and 9 of Jerry Coyne's Why Evolution is True addresses. Still under genetic drift, we know that allele frequencies may increase by chance and reach fixation within subpopulations and decrease by chance and be lost in others. We see this happen with many species and many subpopulations, which is really a big part of the modern definition of evolution. The change in allele frequencies is key. So, tying everything back together under genetic drift, there are random fluctuations of allele frequencies, which would equal to non-adaptive evolution, but evolution nonetheless. Humans are very complex organisms, and unlike what most people think is true, we did not come from chimpanzees, and rather chimps are known to be our cousins. Humans and chimps share 98.4% of their DNA and can tell us about shared behavior. This relationship tells us about our shared traits among primates like eyes in front of our heads, grasping hands, and having hierarchies. What scientists believe, due to the tremendous amount of fossil evidence and evolutionary development found within the fossil record, was that there was an evolutionary process that saw primates move out of East Africa and transform the Earth into an actual planet of the apes, I guess you could say. We also believe that a catastrophe killed off dinosaurs, and we saw what is called an adaptive radiation of humans. All creationists, though, draw the line at humans. They say that the gap between us and other primates was unbridgeable by evolution and must therefore have involved an act of special creation. According to fossils and DNA sequences used to establish our place in the tree of evolution, we are apes descended from other apes, and our closest cousin is the chimpanzee, whose ancestors diverge from our own several million years ago in Africa. These are indisputable facts, and it should produce some sort of satisfaction and wonder, for they connect us to all organisms, the living and the dead. This example of dispersal and migration can be used under the idea of migration drift equilibrium to explain why evolution is true. Under MDE, migration can bring in different alleles and will change allele frequencies. Now again, change in allele frequencies is a huge part on the definition of evolution. So is MDE proven under the actual definition of evolution? The answer is yes. Evolution by natural selection has 3 requirements: variation within the population, differential survival and reproduction, heritability of traits that increase fitness. As we have seen through time, many populations are showing these 3 things, and when they are showing these criteria, they are considered to be evolving through natural selection. Whether it's through natural selection or through migration drift equilibrium or genetic drift, populations have been proven to be evolving because they meet the criteria of each model. We do have to remember and address other misconceptions of natural selection. There is no necessity to evolve, especially if the environment is unchanging. Natural selection is not goal-driven, and there will not be the ultimate or the best variant. And there are constraints, just like with anything, and limit perfection. Also, natural selection is not evolution, and natural selection is not evolution by natural selection. My favorite topic would probably be this one, of phylogenetic niche conservatism. To me, I think this is one of the strongest evidence biologists and evolutionists have against the skeptics of evolution, and more specific human evolution. Under this idea, you have an ancestral species that was spread out geographically, and over time, maybe the habitat has changed, and you now can predict where other species would be based on the ancestral species that is based on the fossil record and DNA sequencing. Descendant lineages that are assumed to be sister to each other are expected to have similar niches and have some differences, but have a lot of overlapping factors. So you use these to predict where you would find either of the species. Like I said earlier, our anatomy places us in the order of primates along with monkeys, apes, and all are sharing traits such as forward-facing eyes, fingernails, color vision, and opposable thumbs. Molecular data derived from DNA and protein sequences confirms these relationships and also tells us roughly when we diverge from our relatives. We are most closely related to the chimpanzees, and we diverged from our joint common ancestor about 7 million years ago. To many, fossil evidence is psychologically more convincing than molecular data. Learning that we share 98.5% of our DNA sequence with chimps, but it's another thing entirely to see the skeleton of an Australopithecine with its small ape-like skull perched atop a skeleton nearly identical to that of humans. As the fossils become more recent, we should see brains getting larger, canine teeth getting smaller, and the tooth row becoming less rectangular and more curved, and posture becoming more erect. And this is exactly what we see. The record of human evolution is one of the best confirmations we have of an evolutionary prediction. Again, we don't and do not expect to have a complete fossil record of human ancestry, but we do have a bush of many different species, with most species having went extinct without leaving descendants. We have learned that many close evolutionary cousins of humans had died out without leaving descendants. An early set of fossils from Kenya, grouped as Australopithecus anamensis, shows hints of bipedality from a single fossilized leg bone. The decisive find for this idea was made by Donald Johansen, who was prospecting for fossils in the Afar region of Ethiopia. They had stumbled across the bones of a single individual formerly named AL2881, but you may know her as Lucy. Her fragments were then assembled, and she turned out to be a new species with a useful attribute that she walked on two legs. We can tell this by looking at her thigh bone and how it connects to the pelvis at one end and to the knee at its other end. When knuckle-walking apes try to walk upright, they waddle like penguins because their femurs are slightly splayed out, making them bow-legged. If you take a primate fossil and look at how the femur and the pelvis fit, you can tell whether the creature walked on two legs or four. So, what's the problem with evolution? What's not a problem is the lack of evidence. Evolution is more than a scientific theory. It is a scientific fact, or so Coyne says. We have looked at evidence from many areas: the fossil record, biogeography, embryology, vestigial structures, suboptimal design, all of this showing that organisms have evolved. We have seen new species form both in real time and in the fossil record. We have observed natural selection in action and have every reason to think that it can produce complex organisms and features. The controversies of evolution are in fact the sign of a vibrant, thriving field. A science without controversy is a science without progress. Many people require more than just evidence before they'll accept evolution.
What propelled the evolution of humans? The answer, as we can see, is obvious. We have large amount of fossil evidence, which is why it is easier to document evolutionary theory than to understand the forces behind it. What happened to Neanderthals? Did they evolve into modern humans? There's two theories to what may have happened to this missing link of human evolution. The first is a multi-regional theory which proposes that there was an evolutionary replacement. Homo erectus and perhaps Homo neanderthals simply evolved into Homo sapiens, independently in several areas, perhaps because natural selection was acting in the same way all over Asia, Europe, and Africa. The second theory is out of Africa theory. which proposes that modern Homo sapiens originated in Africa and spread, physically replacing Homo erectus and the Neanderthals, perhaps by outcompeting them for food. The beast within us. A common belief about evolution is that if we recognize that we are only evolved mammals, there will be nothing to prevent us from acting like beasts. In response to whether as humans, since evolution proves we descend from apes, will we be genetically hardwired to behave like beasts? Evolutionist Richard Dawkins claims that our forebears may not have been entirely beastly after all. And in any case, the jungle with its variety of animals, of which live in quite complex and cooperative societies, is not as lawless as the saying implies. Environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. According to evolutionary psychologists, we must retain many behaviors that evolved in the EEA even if they are no longer adaptive or maladaptive. The EEA backed Dawkins' claim that indeed there is behaviors that are retained from our descendants, and just because we descend from apes does not mean that we will retain the beast-like behaviors. Eventually, the behaviors will be changed or lost according to the environment of the new individual.
First attempt in genetic heritage was in 1975, which resulted in humans and chimps differing an average of 1%. With recent studies, that went up to 1.5%. But given that that's a change in a protein sequence is much more substantial than it seems. And mapping a genome, there is more than 80% of shared proteins which differ in at least one amino acid. Molecular evolutionist studies show that there's also a difference in the presence of genes. More than 6% of genes in humans are not in chimps, and over 1,400 novel genes in humans that are not in chimps. Also, in the number of copies of shared genes. For example, the salivary enzyme amylase, which breaks down starches in the mouth, is only seen in a single copy in chimps, but averages in 6 in a human. Not much can be said about the gene that made humans. There is one candidate, the FOXP2, but that will require cross genetics of chimps and humans. Race is a population of a species that are both geographically separated and differ genetically in one or more traits. Other plants and animals have races like mice that differ in color and coat. By definition, the human species does have different races, which just indicates that the human species doesn't differ from other evolved species. It does bring up the question of how much divergence, and does it fit with fossil record, and what kind of selection drove such differences. Physical appearances in the last 3 decades show that 10 to 15% of all genetic variation is different from different species, and are only expressed through physical appearances. 85 to 90% of genetic variation differs in individuals within a given race. Racial differences, although small, gives us clear evidence of evolutionary pressures that acted in different areas, which can be useful in medicinal purposes when looking at certain diseases like sickle cell anemia. Most genetic sequencing differences are minor, others are more visually dramatic, such as hair and skin color, body form, and nose shape. Why have small diverging features become so obvious? Adaptations respond to different environments. Darker skin provides protection from UV in tropical areas. Paler skin or higher latitude allows penetration of light for vitamin D synthesis. Sexual selection can drive greater variation. which is seen by some biologists as being assessed by potential mates. Gene cultural coevolution is a change in cultural environment that can lead to the types of selection on genes through sexual selection. Since sexual selection can act fast, it makes a candidate for driving a fast evolutionary physical traits that occurred since most recent ancestor. The controversy in behavioral changes brings up the question if evolution has resulted in smarter, more athletic, or cannier individuals. There is no data to back this up. Although different behaviors and IQs are observed, it could have taken effect from environmental or cultural influences. Examination of cross-cultural adoption studies show that cultural influences are strong. The psychologist Steven Pinker quoted, "If you adopt children from a technologically underdeveloped part of the world, they will fit into the modern society just fine," which indicates no innate difference in behavior in different people. Although traits such as hair types and skin color have developed in populations, they can be seen as special cases driven by environmental differences between location and sexual selection for external appearances. Selection has not resulted in major differences between races, but it has affected populations within different ethnic groups. For example, lactose digestion, which is found in milk, the lactose enzyme that breaks down the sugar into glucose. And galactose is, of course, seen with humans as infants. But as they develop, the production of lactase stops, which can result in complete loss of ability to process lactose. Loss of lactase is perhaps resulting of natural selection in some populations, since our ancestors did not have a process of lactase after a certain period. Populations that have grown tolerant to lactose are usually populations that raise cows, such as European countries and the Middle East population. Studies show that the domestication of cows began 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. So a study that was done to extract DNA from a 7,000-year-old European skeleton showed that it was indeed lactose intolerant. Lactose tolerance is an example of gene cultural coevolution, since ancestors with tolerant gene had significant reproductive advantage, which resulted in offspring with higher offspring. Are we still evolving? Challenges of our ancestors have decreased due to medicine, sanitation, and nutrition. Traits that would have been unfit traits in our ancestors can now be rectified with medical intervention or simply correction glasses or dentistry. Genes that were once useful to our ancestors can now be seen as bad. For instance, the fascination of sweets is perhaps heritable because our ancestors encountered sweets rarely, and now it's so disposable, which is leading to many health issues. Is de-evolution occurring? Yes, to some degree, becoming more adapted to modern environments that create new types of selection, which gives room for improvement through genetic variation. Every species has genetic variation to respond to every form of selection, although there are unnoticeable genome adaptations, where genome adapts to many new sources of mortality. But not every source. For instance, conditions influenced by environments and as well as genetics such as obesity, diabetes, heart disease may not respond to selection because it began after reproduction. The human species is still evolving. Human fossil records and recent studies in human genetics show that humans are evolved mammals, built by the same processes that transformed every other organism, and are not a finished product of evolution and is still in process. We are not evolution's puppet. Parts of behavior might be encoded in our genes, which is programmed by our natural selection of our ancestors. But genes aren't destiny. Geneticists have long discovered that genetics doesn't mean unchangeable. Many environmental factors can have effect in the expression of genes. For example, juvenile diabetes can be monitored or eliminated with insulin, or we can simply practice composure when it comes to certain sweets. Altruistic and kind gestures are not all instilled directly by evolution. Change is occurring so rapidly to be solely subjected by our inherited genes. Evolution gives us our origin, not exactly our future. But we do know that evolution acts at random and just is, but that doesn't necessarily entail that life is purposeless. Albert Einstein saw the study of nature as a spiritual experience.